Hello and welcome to the Global Innovators in Business series. In this series, we interview leaders and innovators from different fields to share their experiences and advice with undergraduate students to provide inspiration and motivation. We are so happy to have with us Mr. Han Shen Lin. Han is the Capstone Project Director for the NYU Shanghai Masters in Science in Quantitative Finance program and Assistant Professor of Practice in Finance. Han also led the China corporate banking business, which advised Wells Fargo MNC clients on their U.S.-China cross-border strategic financing and trade needs. Thank you so much for being here, Han.
It's a pleasure to join, Christopher. Program has quite a reputation ahead of it, and I definitely feel honored to be able to join today.
I'm so glad to have you here. And this episode will be very interesting because your background and your experience is actually quite unique, as it's so international and so wide-ranging. So how did you start on this path into finance?
So it was honestly when I first graduated from undergraduate, and this was quite a number of years back in 1993, 94. I really wasn't too sure what I was going to do, nor what my passion was. However, there was one aspect that I did want to commit to, which was understanding the world and to have an international focused career. Now, I happen to have some benefit of this exposure because and when I was serving in the Corps at the time, this was during 1990, and Desert Shield, Desert Storm had just started. And at that time, there was actually a concern that it could escalate across the Middle East. And so the Marine Corps unit I was with, I had just finished my Marine Corps boot camp training. And after finishing one semester at University of Michigan, I was called out before the semester finished. I was mobilized, as it was called, and sent to Okinawa, where 3rd Marine Division was organized, and we were doing amphibious operations, which is essentially attacking by the sea. And I was part of an infantry unit at the time. But as luck had it, the war had ended very quickly. But instead of going back to the US, I was sent to the Philippines, helping to guard and act as a security element for US military bases called Subic Naval Base and also Clark Air Force Base. The biggest problem actually was not so much any security issues as when the Mount Pinatubo volcano blew. And at that time, for about 7 days, 7 nights, I did not see the sun anymore. In fact, we were literally buried by volcanic ash. But after the 7th day coming out, we were involved on a number of humanitarian missions to really help fix hospitals, really help to save people, reunite children with their parents. And it was quite an eye-opener for me because I could see very quickly, having grown up quite comfortably in the US, how fast a natural disaster or other event could suddenly change your life. So when I went back to University of Michigan, I ended up studying business in a program very similar to what University of Pennsylvania offers at the Wharton School. And having initially pursued a path at investment banking, that was the direction that it seemed like everybody was going to, I actually switched and went to work for a company called GE and went through their financial management training program. And having gone through that a couple of years, I had the experience of working for a large company. Then I got restless and wanted to explore humanitarian areas as well. So I spent 3.5 years working in the Peace Corps as a volunteer business advisor, helping to raise money for the Odessa Philharmonic Orchestra in Ukraine, where I was posted, and also working as a business advisor for Ukrainian small and medium enterprises. So during that 3.5 years in Ukraine as a Peace Corps volunteer, I was certainly not rich materially, but I'd like to think I was much more rich spiritually in the sense that I had a wonderful time working with the locals there and seeing life as they lived. Because the Peace Corps was unique in the sense that they purposely wanted to give you a taste of what local living would be. So your stipend was actually very small. I think I was given about $120 a month. Now, I was lucky to be given housing there, but essentially I ate as everyone did. I lived as everyone did, but I had to learn the language as well. And since I was posted to Odessa, Ukraine, which was the southern part of Ukraine, and the predominant language was Russian, I essentially spent 3+ years speaking Russian every day. And that was pretty difficult because at that time, I was already about 28 years old. After spending 3.5 years in the Peace Corps, I came back and went to go pursue graduate study at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I ended up in the China Studies program. After 2.5 years, I was looking actually to figure out what I was going to pursue. And at that time, we had just had our first technology crash, and this was roughly around 2003. So I couldn't find a job, and I struggled. But in the meantime, for about a year or so, I took 3 different part-time jobs to make ends meet. I was working for a consulting company. I helped to teach economics at SAIS, which is the shortened form of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I was a fitness center manager at the Washington, D.C. Jewish Community Center. And after about 1 year or so, I found a job working for a regional bank called Wachovia Bank that happened to have an international banking presence. Having gone through their training program, they asked me if I'd be willing to go overseas, and I ended up in Beijing, China, as a relationship manager working with the Chinese banks. Over a number of years, I was steadily promoted. I was relocated to Shanghai, and I helped to build out not only their China business, but a lot of their Asia Pacific business as well. So fast forward a couple of years, I decided that a number of my clients were getting very smart, so I went back to graduate school part-time twice. Not only graduating from New York University's Masters of Science in Global Finance, but I also pursued a study of law, specifically Chinese law, at Fudan University. And so, in other words, I quickly tried to combine 3 graduate school educations: international studies, finance, and law. And I spent about 17 years in banking, after which, having left, I went through another career pivot and decided to pursue education at NYU as a professor. And all those years I spent in banking, I also had another passion, which was serving in the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, because it was only through all these years of working in China that I realized I did have a passion, which was actually fostering good US-China relations. Now, this hasn't been a very easy proposition, and we've seen how complex US-China relations have become. But at least in my role, having spent a number of years in banking, I got to see how US-China relations ebbed and flowed from a financial and trade standpoint. But at least as a professor, I had the opportunity to practice soft power, to really help to fine-tune and to really encourage young students to better understand US-China relations, and ideally, whichever career path they take, that they could be part of an advocate in fostering better relations. And so that takes us to where we are today.
I'm slightly sorry I asked how you got to finance, because clearly that path was not finance. That path was a combination of humanitarian efforts, the military, like working like different graduate programs, and that all combined into the culmination of first finance, then education, which
Mhm.
just goes to show like how I don't know, different ways your career can go, and how you can finally get to the point where you are finally today. But there's so much to unpack there, and I would love to get into that very soon. One of the first questions is, I mean, I know like right now, having worked in Ukraine, having worked in that environment, like what lessons do you learn during those 3 years? And like the situation is very, very challenging now there. Like from what you learned then, how does that like can that help in the current situation from what you knew then, and to bring that to now?
Mm. So, I have to tell you that, especially when I was, going through the different experiences, Marine Corps, GE, Peace Corps, I honestly wasn't sure if these experiences would actually be useful. I actually thought that, well, they were interesting chapters in my life, and now I've got to find a job to figure out how to pay my rent. So it was actually, um, uh, uh, you know, a period of uncertainty for me, and I never really started to appreciate the lessons until later in my career. But I did have a couple of practical benefits, which was this. When I was in banking, I was often what was called in the client-facing role. And so that meant working with a number of executives at different companies, helping them think through what their China investment and financing strategy is. So that sounds very parochial in many ways, but you find out when you're doing these types of deals with other folks that you would think are very professional and business focused, that in fact, everyone has their own personal interest and they have a life as well. And so when you're trying to engage with clients, the first thing you're always looking for is some common interest, something to engage them with beyond just sticking a spreadsheet in front of them and trying to talk about a deal, for example. And so all the years of traveling the world, looking at it, having made mistakes, having had successes as well, they make you a little bit more normal, a person of interest. And when you have some type of interest or you've had different stories, that makes that engagement process, finding rapport with somebody, that much easier. And I found out from a practical standpoint, it actually helped to make me a more interesting banker when I had to talk about finance, because beforehand, I had something interesting to talk about just as a person. Um, but that didn't really come out until later in the later years. And what I did find out is all the years in banking, having learned to give presentations, having learned to really focus my thoughts to either being able to talk in 30 seconds in the elevator, sometimes called your elevator speech, or learning to give a more formal board presentation, that ability to figure out what are your key points became useful. And it was because of that that I felt like I had a better opportunity in preparation to become a professor. But I do keep in mind this. I made a number of mistakes when I was younger in my career as well. And I actually found out, having made mistakes as a younger person, gave me better rapport with my students because I'm very sympathetic to the challenge that they have in looking for jobs today. And it's quite an up and down process, but I can only say that if I made it through, they too will find their path.
Could you share one of those challenges or mistakes that you faced, and how did you overcome it?
Mm. So one of the things that I was very aware about when I was in Ukraine was that, yes, I could see that um, their livelihood was constrained in many more different ways, okay, and that their ability to have a good living, to think about their future, was often balanced by what was happening with their government, what was happening with the geopolitical areas around them. And one of the things that I had to remind myself over and over was I grew up in a very comfortable middle-class environment. I grew up in a environment where I didn't have to think so much about where the next meals would come from, and that I could focus on my education and ideally look forward to a better future. And quickly, having both served in the Marine Corps, where I saw how a volcano could just destroy everything and take you from a position of prosperity to poverty in a matter of a week or so. And then suddenly seeing how in Ukraine, how difficult life was coming from initially how the whole economic system was trying to transfer from a former state-run organization, authoritarian government, to more of an open market. That these struggles aren't quite an easy process, and having seen as a business advisor how difficult it was to start a business, to get financing, or to figure out how to think about a market in the first place. I initially felt like I had a little bit of hubris, a little bit of condescending arrogance, having come from the US. And having lived in other countries, I quickly found out that was a terrible way to try to educate others about how to improve their lives. So each time I tried to talk about, well, this is what the US did, this is what the US did, I'd later realized that simply did not work, because without a good cultural context of the life they struggled with, I couldn't connect, and a lot of my ideas pretty much made no sense. So I have been much more, I guess, put it this way, much more humble in how I try to approach talking to another person without having better understood where they came from. And that's so important, because we've been grown up in the US, for example, having a fantastic, comfortable life. If you don't have that humility, you find out it's not only a terrible way to try to advise others, but it's a terrible way to work even in the organization you're part of. Because I can often see in a changing organization where you have acquisitions and divestitures, the person that you manage today could eventually be your boss tomorrow. And so you want to make sure you treat everyone with kindness and respect, because you never know when you may need it from them as well.
It's so true. Stepping into the other person's shoes, and especially in business, understanding their cultural context, understanding what matters to them is really, really crucial. And I think that's such a great point that you highlighted there. In your career, you've worked in many different places around the world. Has there been a large gap in what you see as like the way businesses run, and how people respond to certain types of ways you speak or the ways you teach, and how is that difference manifested? And like, what is the takeaway of how can you be the best communicator, the best partner for them based off of their culture, and within the context of their culture and their context?
So I was reading an interesting article yesterday about Generation Z in China, and it was fascinating. It was actually a good article in a media channel called The Sixth Tone, in reference to the fact that the Chinese language has many different tones, right? And the sixth tone, and it was a discussion of the fact that Generation Z in China, that whereas previous generations might have been willing to work overtime without extra pay, or to stay in the office later because their bosses are simply there, even though the young Generation Z had nothing to work on, that they were pushing back on that notion, pushing back on just being taken for granted, pushing back on where companies violate labor laws and don't pay you for overtime if the boss is suddenly asking you to do so. And there's always going to be a clash of generations, because some of the older managers have considered the younger generation quite arrogant, quite thinking about themselves without thinking about the greater whole. Whereas the younger generation, they talked about rectifying the workplace, where organizations shouldn't be taking advantage of people and that individuals indeed have their rights, how they express themselves, whether they choose to work overtime, and the types of assignments that interest them. And ultimately, the types of companies that represent their values of who they'd want to work for. So China is no different. Having gone through several decades of economic growth where people sacrificed, the question is, at some point, how do you find that balance with the fact of being able to meet the interest of younger students who have their own sense of values? And I found that fascinating because I remind myself, I'm getting pretty old myself. I'm 50 years old now. And I sometimes realize, boy, when I look at my students, they do have different values, whether they will, how they approach assignments, how they approach projects. But I also remind myself that they're the future leadership of China. And so I have been very, mindful of the fact that, well, just because I said something worked when I was a young person certainly doesn't represent what may work for them. And so I have been much more on a cause of listening to what matters to them. And at the same time, that helps me to learn, because if I teach with a perspective that everything I did back when I was their age worked and why it's so much better, I will certainly not have any ideas that resonate with them. And so I am cautious in the sense that when I talk to them about assignments, projects, I always try to get a bearing of what their other class burdens look like. And to the extent that I can reach my academic objectives and yet also be flexible so that they can balance their academic load, look for internships, do their capstone projects, and do their own job search. I know they're balancing a lot, so I'd rather try to be helpful as much as I can, rather than try to carve out my space where they're required to do my work, and I have no consideration of what other time constraints they've got.
As a representative of the very, very early parts of the Gen Z group, I can definitely concur in the fact that I think there is a generational shift in how we approach communicating and confronting traditional behavior or traditional behaviors or workplace traditions that sometimes was built long ago, but we're trying to kind of like break down the walls and seeing if they actually work for us as well. I think that actually is a very, very interesting segue into, as you've seen in your roles, like a huge part of your role is to help other companies come into China, as well as vice versa, and then look at how like Chinese companies can be a part of the global community and network. On the first part, what have companies who have gone into China, multinational companies who enter China successfully, done well, done right? And do you think that success can be replicated by all types of industries or companies, or is that still very, very limited to certain types of industries?
This is actually a very good question. So I spent much of my banking career helping US companies think through what their China market entry strategy is, and also working with a number of Chinese companies that were looking to expand globally. And at least in looking at these companies, there was an interesting statistic that was put out by the American Chamber of Commerce this past year, which I happen to serve on the board of as well. And it was a question of, very simply, is China transparent? Okay. In the other words, when you work in the Chinese regulatory environment, do you think that the laws are transparent? And the answer tended to vary based on how long you've lived in China. If you just came to China for about 1 to 2 years, the average rating was, in fact, China was not very transparent at all. It was very opaque in the governance system and how things affected a business. But ironically, the longer you were in China, 8 to 10 years or longer, suddenly thought it was more transparent. And this is the exact same business environment it has that everyone understands. And what had happened is that the longer you had been in China, the more you understood how to interpret the openness of certain Chinese regulations. Now, it's quite different than the US side. When you're working in the US, there's much more of a legalistic approach, a more black and white understanding of what regulations are. And this is a shock in many ways for a number of Chinese companies coming to the US. But when you're a US company coming into China, you find out that regulation is much more open to interpretation. Now, there's a couple of different reasons why. There's an expression in China that the mountain is high, the emperor is far away, where the central government could give a specific central government related regulation. It means that once you're at the local government, there can be slightly different interpretations simply because the local conditions tend to be very different as well. And when you have a bit of that open space towards interpretation, it can be quite baffling for US companies in China because they try to take it from a legalistic standpoint. But in fact, it can be an opportunity for US companies in China as well, because if something comes down that looks hard and fast, in fact, you can interpret in different ways in a best way that helps your business work better. So I spend a lot of time trying to think about the legal and regulatory structure because oftentimes it's not appreciated that if you're in finance, what you can and cannot do in the financial world is very much shaped by the legal regulatory structure. And that's actually why I ended up spending a separate graduate degree studying Chinese law as well. But I'd say legal regulatory structure, those are useful to learn because they are in fact impacted by the cultures of the countries that you operate in. And I've always been a fan and interest in understanding the cultures of different countries.
From your experience, is there a recent company that have succeeded well in entering the China market entry strategy or implementing the China market entry strategy? If so, what did they do right?
So there actually are many US companies that have been very successful. Your Coca-Colas, your GEs, even smaller businesses, but sizable business like Driscoll Berries that sells raspberries and blueberries out here. And I would say that there are a couple of commonalities. I think number one, they tried to work within the Chinese system, but they didn't sacrifice the US company values because what it turned out to be was that many of these values actually attracted local consumers as well. And this is especially true among the younger generation that have certain values such as understanding environmental, social governance, or have a strong interest in climate or the environment and green types of interests. That a lot of the US companies that bring it here, they find out that these types of values and interests resonate with the younger generation. So that's important. And that actually helps them establishing a strong market foothold because it's something different than just simply trying to compete on cost. I think for a number of younger Chinese as well, China has been an exciting place to grow, particularly in the last several decades where China has had steady upwards momentum. But now China is going through a bit of an economic challenge. COVID has been a challenge for many of them. And now within 2022, as there's a shift into 2023, the government has remade a pivot to try to refocus on economic growth. And for a lot of the young people, that is important because everyone is focused on finding jobs. And certainly one thing they've identified is between the ages 16 to 24 years old, the unemployment rate is about close to 20%. And that's hard. And that's hard. And so there is a high focus again on saying, well, yes, China is changing, but what does it mean for younger people in terms of employment? So in many ways, if young Chinese are able to find jobs with US companies, that's a big plus because it may share similar values. But ideally, if they have a strong interest in going and thinking about other countries and the international world, these multinational companies might be able to give them a culture that looks at both China and the world.
That's very, very interesting. And I think what he said about this growing focus on economic development, especially to help the 16 to 24-year-olds find the jobs that they're looking for, is definitely something that this platform and this channel is also very, very heavily focused on too, so that they can find careers that are looking for impact, that can allow them to see the world in a different way that they want to see it. One question I have on this broader subject is, have you seen any change in China's or companies in China or the consumer behavior in China to focus more towards companies that drive impact or companies that have a social consciousness or something that is like ESG focused? How has that shift been translated into the Chinese society and Chinese market?
Right. So I think one of the interesting trends is I was talking to one of the major cosmetic companies in China, a US company that has decided to expand tremendously in China by setting up Shanghai as a second global headquarters. And they made an interesting observation. They said that one of the key generational shifts in the Chinese market, particularly for them targeting working class professional women, okay, was that a lot of the current Chinese generation, they grew up in a very prosperous China, and they took pride in that. And one of the things that had happened during the COVID period in the last 3 years was it actually restricted the imports of a lot of US types of goods into China. And so it fostered attention of the younger generation to think about locally made Chinese products, looking at locally growing Chinese brands. And so what has happened is that, yes, there's an appreciation of foreign brands, but not the expectation that foreign brands are always going to be better, that local Chinese brands might better resonate with the local values that are among the younger Chinese, and that if these products also happen to be very high quality, but reasonably priced, that these local brands could actually take tremendous market share. And so this type of consumer behavior is something that has had US companies rethink what their value proposition is in the Chinese markets. In other words, that meant that US companies, rather than having a global product and then pushing the sales into China, it meant that the global companies had to better understand China and create more locally appropriate brands and products for them. And that reflected the fact that how Chinese tended to look at ESG, what was interesting to them in terms of local products, such as looking at the secondhand market of clothing, for example, and looking increasingly at environmental types of products that help to conserve water, for example. These are things that look like they're not just short-term marketing campaigns, but very much long-term trends that actually happen to dovetail with what the government wants to go. And so when you're looking at US strategies coming into China, number one, you're thinking about changes of consumer behavior. Second, you're thinking about what the government is trying to allocate capital to into certain industries. And then number three, as you're thinking about how you allocate your capital in China, It's always going to be relative to what other opportunities are across the rest of Asia, of which there are many as well. So it's a multi-tiered process, but oftentimes people ask, well, China was great and successful in the past several decades. What's the next China? And for many businesses, it could very well continue to be China, but certainly as a business strategy, thinking about the political stability, economic market size, a growing middle class, a very scalable supply chain, pro-growth policies, strong local government support. These are all factors that, as you're thinking about the ecosystem that you need to operate and succeed in, they're going to continue to be major factors driving your investment.
Mm.
So
Interesting. Yes. That's very, very unique of a take or that's very, very interesting of a take that the ESG strategy has been adapted towards more China focused based off of what kind of the governments or kind of what the people actually are really the culture is looking for. And the same ESG strategy that works in the US might not work in China or in a different area. And that goes back to the point where each of the companies have to find a localized strategy to enter the market. One question, I know, just to probe a little bit more, because I think a lot of the examples that we have brought up, like Coca-Cola, like the raspberry and blueberry brands, like the cosmetics industry, is almost like consumables or consumer-based products that's they're edible or food, or I know KFC, McDonald's have done extraordinarily well. In other industries like tech or pharmaceuticals or banking, like industries that have there been very successful examples that other companies going into China can learn from?
So that's a good question. So one of the big changes, if you ever have a career in the international field, is that you now spend more time thinking about geopolitical changes, okay, and how that might affect the market you're operating in. So you actually bring up a very good point. The business environment tends to differ by industries. So for example, you talked about technology, okay? So one of the challenges that's going on is as the US thinks about its policy in relation to China, our own State Department, our own US government has mentioned about what is called a 3-tier invest, align, and compete strategy, where the US invests in itself to improve its competitiveness, where it aligns with other countries that share common interests, and of course, where it's competing directly with countries, not only in China, but around the world as well. And so part of the US policy to compete more and effectively with China, for example, is that US companies operating in China, that they be more competitive as well. But there's an increasing consideration that if US companies operate in China, that they do so without necessarily sacrificing US values or put national security at stake. Now, that is something very new to be thinking about, because suddenly when US companies think about their commercial strategies in China, there has to be a greater awareness of what the guideposts are without crossing any lines that might affect national security. This is particularly true in the technology side, where we're starting to see aspects of decoupling, particularly in the semiconductor space, and that we see this momentum towards decoupling that we don't know how it's going to end, or if these types of forces might affect other areas of science as well. Okay. Now, that basically means if you're going to be operating in this cross-border space between US and China, you need to be paying much more attention to a lot of the political dynamics going on between countries. However, that's actually an opportunity for you as well, because there's such a huge demand for young people who can understand US and China policies, who can understand that cross-border space and figure out ways to make things succeed. So to the extent that you're young, all we can say is this, or all that I often recommend is this, is that I don't know what the future is going to hold, but if you have a good investment in studying China and the US, boy, whether you choose to go into working in the NGO space, specifically non-government organizations, or you choose to serve in the foreign service, or you're in the sciences, or whether you work in the commercial business space, there's going to be huge opportunities because there's just not enough people who can understand both sides and figure out ways to bridge the gaps between US and China in a way that can help you succeed looking forward.
Yes, couldn't agree more. We've talked to Dean Jeffrey Garrett, former dean at the Wharton School, and I think he mentioned many times during this interview that this was in 2020, and even before COVID, but also amidst COVID, the speed of decoupling has really increased, and it poses a great challenge to both countries in the future to continue to keep these bridges intact as we move into a new kind of relationship in these two countries' future.
Yeah.
Discussing that, I think this broader relationship has so much to encompass with. One of these things, and I know that you teach about this as well, is this like idea of the control of currency and outflow and inflow of currency. Could you give a quick explanation of why this is so important in a global geopolitical context, and what do you think going forward this relationship will look like on this space?
Okay, so that's diving in a little bit more towards the finance space. And so for those of you that are in the audience who don't spend your days like I do thinking about finance, I'll try to keep it reasonably straightforward. Basically, when you have a financial system, an international financial system, you need three things for it to be properly lubricated and operating smoothly. You need, number one, free movement of capital, okay, so that funds can move in and out of different countries. Number two, you need the free movement of data, because you need as much information as possible to, for example, make a reasonable forecast of where an investment's opportunities are. And finally, number three, you need free movement of people. People are the talent that help you to identify the different types of opportunities depending on the country you're operating or working in. So movement of capital, people, data, those are the cornerstones of having a smoothly functioning financial system. But every country has certain preferences and policies in place, okay, that may create friction. And some of it is very valid. For example, you may not necessarily want everyone focused on property or profit because you want consumer protection as well. So there's always going to be policies there that can, that can shape how a financial system of a country grows. And this is no different than for China as well. And so when I think about the financial world, one of the things that has been happening has been this. The US has been going through a period of raising its interest rates. And that has put a problem not only for China, but for the rest of the world, because capital always seeks the highest yield. And as the US is raising interest rates to fight inflation, well, that comparatively higher yield has been gradually sucking capital from other countries. And so what we have seen in China is that a lot of capital in China's capital markets, people have sold off their assets in China, converted their renminbi into the US dollars, and taken it out of China. That's presented problems for China at two levels. number one, China has seen that as everyone sells their local currency, it has depreciated relative to the dollar. And number two, as everyone has sold their local currency in China to purchase the US dollars, that has put a drain on China's foreign reserves. And China needs a lot of those US dollars to import important goods such as commodities that are all priced in the US dollars. So China is faced with a situation. They need to grow in order to stimulate and really continue their economic growth. They need to essentially lower their interest rates. But they can't do so too much, because if they lower their interest rates too much, well, more capital will flow out of China to the US. And so therefore, China's at a situation where how do they stimulate their economy, especially as they've tried to loosen up COVID restrictions? And so they've been focused on a number of fiscal policies, helping businesses by reducing their tax load, providing various subsidies. But the big challenge of China's economy has been consumption. People just haven't wanted to buy because in a COVID environment, people are afraid to go out to restaurants. And so what we have seen is that, well, the market is very challenging for not only Chinese businesses, but US businesses. But at least it looks like the government is trying to start from the top by helping to build consumer confidence by saying, hey, we know it's been a very difficult period with COVID over the last 2 to 3 years, but we are committing ourselves at the highest government level to focus on innovation, to focus on entrepreneurialism. Now, there's no guarantee this will actually work, but at least they're trying to set the tone to say, we know fighting COVID has been difficult. Let's refocus on the economy. And so we'll see how this plays out over the next year. There's a lot of challenges going forth, but as the Chinese often say, it's in crisis that you'll also find your opportunities as well. So we'll see how this goes. But again, a number of challenges going forward. Oh, Christopher?
Yes.
Thanks.
Jim Rogers gave the example that, or the Chinese word for weiqi is crisis and opportunity.
Exactly.
Words. So that's very, very true. Time has also flew. Kiki, do you have any other questions for Han?
Yeah, so I have a quick question. I know some students are interested in learning about how a day would be like as a deputy general manager at a global bank in China. So could you please give us a general sharing on that as well?
Okay, so in general, for Wells Fargo Bank, it's one of the big 4 US banks in China. And we were under a number of key businesses where I would work with the CEOs of large US multinationals. But at the same time, I would think about governance and risk management for the bank, because so much of what a bank can and cannot do is often based on talking with regulators as well. So in general, every day when I would wake up in the morning, I'd probably have 300 to 500 emails. I would probably have anywhere between 5 to 10 meetings a day discussing multiple issues. And I would try to carve out time to go visit as many clients as possible to get a pulse of the business environment and to try to get a sense of what clients would want in the future. Okay. And one of the things about working in an international organization is when I said I'd have 5 to 10 meetings a day, okay, these were not only client meetings, but many times internal meetings with colleagues in the US. And if you keep in mind that there's about a 13-hour time difference right now between the US East Coast and China Shanghai time, well, my evenings would often be their daytimes. And so we'd often try to switch to have meetings between their daytimes and my daytimes So that often meant that it worked longer hours in the evening. But health is very important. You will burn out very quickly in your career if you don't learn to take care of yourself. So I often had a very disciplined regimen of eating well and exercising quite frequently, okay, to keep up your strong health and watching your diet, particularly when I have to go out and eat with clients quite often. But at the same time, you don't want to lose your center, which means maybe having a significant other. And in my case, having a family with 2 daughters and thinking about their future, because I'm always thinking about their growth as well, and the fact that they will have a very different world than what I see right now. So there's a strong balance between family, looking at your work, but also having good hobbies as well. And so making sure I participated in other associations. I'm quite involved in kickboxing as well, going to the gym. And when you find that balance, you can sustain yourself, because if it's just career alone, you will burn out. But I do keep in mind, boy, sometimes there are certain decisions I just can't make. Sometimes there are many emails I just can't respond to. But you know that it's not the end of the world. And so as long as you sleep well, keep yourself healthy, a solution that you can't find today, you may find tomorrow. But I kept everything in mind, knowing that, hey, the bank has to grow. I'm thinking about its risk governance. I'm thinking about new talent. Who is a young banker today that could very well be a senior vice president tomorrow? So there's a lot of focus on thinking about talent growth and retention, because I know that eventually I'll be leaving soon as well. So I want to make sure that whatever I've done, I've left the bank in a better situation than when I first came into it. So that's what my life was like daily. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing this.
It's a pleasure, Kiki. That's a good question, because there's a lot of writing and a lot of emails. And what you find out is the most important skill you can have is how to sell an idea, whether it's to a client or whether it is internally within your organization, as you ask for practical support from the head office, or you try to pitch for more investment into your China operations.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has really been so insightful and such a good learning opportunity for all of us. If at the end you just have like one line or a few words for the students that's our age looking forwards into their careers, what would you say?
There are so many profound things that all of your previous speakers have given that I oftentimes think about the advice that I've given, and if I actually took it myself, right? You hear a lot about that. I would encourage from a practical side. So I'm going to take something very practical that probably befits my career in finance and banking, which is this. Be very conscientious of how you spend your money and try to save. Now, you can argue that, yes, you can try to save for the long term and so on and so forth. But the reason why I try to say to save your money and to be conscious of your spending is this. Especially in this changing world, you will keep finding multiple opportunities. You may find that you need some time off to explore a passion, and it's so much harder to do so if you don't have some cash available saved up that can allow you to make that transition. So I have seen many people that simply because they didn't have enough money saved from their current job, that they haven't been willing to try another passion or take that time to do a deep search to find that other job. Because you're going to find you're going to have a lot of jumping in careers. I went from the military to working in the nonprofit world, to working for a large company, to switching into banking, to trying to take different master's and education degrees to improve myself. And each time it was much easier to do so if I knew I had this fund from savings that allowed me to make that choice. So it doesn't sound very grand. It's more of a practical sense, but you want that ability to be able to see as many opportunities, to have that optionality as much as possible. Yeah.
That's such great advice. And yeah, definitely this will be something that we will need as we go forward, alongside our grand visions and ideas. Something to like hold us down and to like keep us grounded is having the savings and having the ability to like afford to take on those risks.